Every day began the same way. I would wake up, get dressed, and go to the kitchen, where Michael was already making coffee. Everything as usual, but with each passing day, I felt something slipping away. At the beginning of our relationship, our morning conversations were full of laughter. We'd discuss plans for the day and dream about the future. But now the conversations were becoming more and more monotonous. Sometimes it felt like we were speaking different languages. I would ask myself, where did we lose that spark that once warmed us? Chicago, a suburb, a cozy home, stability. Everything felt so familiar, but I was missing something more. It wasn't anything specific, more like a sense of emptiness that had been building up month by month. Michael didn't notice. He continued to dive into his work, and into my thoughts. At times, it felt like I was living next to a person, rather than with the one I once dreamed of building a future with. We were two separate worlds that had been too close for too long. I tried to find something that could bring us closer, but instead, I felt more and more alienated. Sometimes I wondered whether this was just a phase in our lives, or if we had truly reached some sort of turning point. Had our journey already been completed, and now we were just waiting for it to end? But everything changed during one evening conversation when Michael suggested something that seemed impossible to me. We were sitting at dinner in our house. Michael was chewing slowly, as usual, taking his time with his portion of pasta, while I, in the meantime, was thinking about something that had nothing to do with food. We hadn't discussed anything serious in a while, as if we had locked ourselves in some kind of circle that we couldn't escape from. What if we tried to change something? His voice pulled me out of my thoughts. I looked up in surprise. It was unexpected, even a little strange. I was trying to understand what exactly he meant. Maybe this was a continuation of our pointless conversation about moving? We had talked about the idea of changing locations, but I had taken it as nothing more than another joke, an expression of dissatisfaction with the monotony of life. But Michael was serious. "Move to the city center," he continued, smiling slightly. "Change everything. A new house, a new pace of life. We've both wanted this for a long time, and now we have a chance to make it happen." I was silent. The city center? Yes, that did sound tempting. "Do you really want this?" I finally asked, feeling how strange and tense the room had become. Michael smiled, but there was a certain uncertainty in his eyes. He didn't want to admit that he had proposed this for more than just a reason. He didn't even know what he was looking for in this suggestion. Maybe it was out of desperation, maybe out of hope to reclaim something that was slipping away between us. I, on the other hand, didn't know what to say. At that moment, I realized that what I truly needed wasn't just a place to live, but something more. But Michael was set on a decision, and I didn't want to disappoint him. After all, perhaps this step would give us the opportunity to start over. "Let's think about it," I said. And although there was no enthusiasm in my words, I felt that behind this suggestion lay something important. The unknown, which might change us. We hadn't made a final decision about moving when Michael proposed something completely unexpected. Instead of immediately starting a new life in the city center, he suggested we spend a few weeks at his parents' old family ranch in Montana. I thought it would be a way to distract ourselves and make an important decision, but honestly, the idea didn't really appeal to me. I had never been fond of secluded places, let alone old houses where everything felt a little worn and forgotten. But Michael was persistent. He said his parents were planning to sell the house, and they wanted us to stay with them until they made their final decision. His voice sounded so confident that I couldn't refuse. After all, what could be wrong with spending time with his family, especially if it could help me understand what I really wanted from our relationship? We packed up and hit the road. Hour after hour, the drive grew longer and more isolated, and I felt the growing silence beginning to press down on me. Michael was absorbed in his thoughts, his gaze clouded with some kind of unease, while I just watched the changing landscape outside the window. Suddenly, it hit me. We were both like this open road. We had long lost our purpose and were just moving forward, not understanding why or where we were going. When we finally arrived at the house, I noticed that it really stood in some secluded corner of Montana. The house was old but cozy. Small windows with flower pots, a moss-covered roof, and hills stretching out around it. The atmosphere was welcoming, but at the same time, something about this place made me feel slightly uneasy. I couldn't figure out what it was. It was the feeling of a long, unavoidable shadow, as though the house hid many stories that didn't want to be told. John, Michael's father, greeted us warmly, but it felt odd. He hugged Michael, gave him a pat on the shoulder, but his gaze was cold. I noticed that he studied me just a little longer than was necessary. A strange wariness flickered in his eyes, but he quickly hid it, trying once again to appear friendly. "It's been a long time," he said, his voice even, but not as warm as I had expected. I smiled in response, but I felt that something in his behavior was unsettling. I'm not sure. Maybe it was just the long drive, but I sensed that this trip wouldn't be just a relaxing break. Questions that didn't have answers began to arise in my mind. Why did I feel that this house, its air and its shadows were not merely a backdrop for a peaceful retreat? Michael went to talk to his father about some matters, leaving me alone with the house and its atmosphere. I decided to take a little walk around the property to see how it had changed since the last time I had been here, but soon I realized that I couldn't shake the strange feeling of being watched. It was as if I were part of something I wasn't supposed to see. After Michael and his father went inside to discuss some matters, I was left alone on the property. I wanted to take a walk and get some distance from the foggy atmosphere that had enveloped us since our arrival. I walked through the old garden, among neglected bushes and trees that clearly hadn't received the proper care. It seemed even nature here felt a little forgotten. The house looked cozy, but there was something strange about it. The empty space, as if no one had lived there for a long time, only shadows creeping across the walls and the floor. I turned my attention back to John. His greeting had been polite, but cold. When he looked at me, it seemed like his eyes were studying every gesture, every movement, as though he were trying to figure out who I really was. I couldn't shake the feeling. I stopped by one of the old trees, noticing how the sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting playful shadows on the ground. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw John. He approached slowly, but with a certain insistence, as if he knew I would be here. He smiled, and I felt the tension in the air immediately increase. Unexpectedly, he suggested we take a walk around the property. "There are such beautiful spots here," he said. "I think you'll appreciate the view. My wife always said this was one of the best places on the ranch." I didn't want to go, but I couldn't refuse. He continued talking, telling me how significant this place was for his family, how many memories were tied to it with his wife, my mother-in-law. I listened, but my gaze kept drifting toward the house, toward the property, and I felt more and more uncomfortable. John spoke so easily about the past, about his life with my mother-in-law, about how they loved spending time here. But in his words, there was more than just nostalgia. It was something greater. Maybe it was love for the place, or maybe for the very idea of what it once was, or perhaps for what remained now that she was gone. Our footsteps were quiet, and I felt the atmosphere around me becoming heavier. It was as if the air on the property had thickened, and every step seemed more noticeable. Suddenly, John stopped. He looked at me, his expression turning serious. "You know," he said, almost whispering, "this place has always been special for our family, and I hope it will become the same for you and Michael." His words didn't sound like just a simple wish. I felt how this admission raised hidden questions in the air. What did he really mean? Why did I feel like his interest in me went beyond ordinary politeness? The silence around us became almost tangible. We stood at the edge of this old garden where every glance seemed too long, and every step felt unnecessary. I couldn't understand exactly what was bothering me, but I could feel that something wasn't right here. Every day I spent in this house became more and more strange. Michael would leave for the city on business, and I would be left alone. At first, I tried to justify my feelings with the strange atmosphere and the new circumstances, but gradually, even in solitude, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't just old, but was hiding something. Everything felt familiar, but at the same time, I began to perceive this space in a different way. The furniture in the house seemed tired, like the walls, which seemed to hold years of stories. But something in these stories frightened me. I couldn't quite figure out what exactly it was. Maybe it was that ever-present shadow that lingered in the air, or John's gaze, which was becoming more and more insistent. His presence in the house, although he tried to be hospitable, created an internal tension in me that hadn't been there before. I felt like he was watching me, tracking my every move. One day, I noticed that John had left an old photograph on the table. It was a picture of his family in front of the ranch, in the very place where I had just taken a walk. I didn't take it right away, but when he went into another room, I couldn't resist and walked over to take a closer look. In the photo was my mother-in-law, young and cheerful, with Michael and his sister, but something in John's expression immediately caught my attention. His gaze was strange, even a little obsessive. There was no open joy, which usually accompanies family photos. It was the look of someone who was tied to something that couldn't be let go of. I returned to the living room and put the photo back. My gaze fell on the antique wardrobe in the corner of the room. It had been there so long that it seemed like part of the wall itself, but in its shadow, there were all the things I didn't want to notice. I started feeling hot. I could sense that with each passing day, that shadow was becoming more and more obvious. Michael continued to be absorbed in his work, and I knew I couldn't stay here forever. I was in this house, but I wasn't a part of it. Yet, something kept pulling me back, to its rooms, to its grounds. Something wouldn't let me be at peace. I couldn't understand why, but it seemed to me that in this house, in these memories, lay the answer to what was happening between Michael and me. Still, I kept staying there. I don't know why. Maybe it was the feeling that it wasn't worth giving everything up so quickly. But with each passing day, I felt more and more that I couldn't trust this place. That day, John suggested we take a walk around the property again. It felt almost like the last time, but something was different this time. He seemed more relaxed, almost as if he wanted to tell me something. Something important that I could only understand here, in this house, among these hills. "You're not too tired, are you?" He asked when I accepted his invitation and stepped out for a walk with him. "Don't worry, I'll show you something special. This place has always been important to our family." I nodded, though in my mind I couldn't help but feel that his words sounded a bit too insistent. We walked along the old fence where the grass had long been unkempt and wildflowers grew in every corner, looking as though they had always belonged there. John began telling me about his childhood, how he spent summer days here with my mother-in-law, how they lovingly tended to every corner of the ranch. I couldn't help but notice how he became absorbed in these memories. His voice softened and his gaze grew more pensive. "You know, she always said this place had to be preserved. My wife—" He paused, and I noticed how his eyes became clouded. He looked out into the distance toward the hills, as if trying to see something that was no longer there. I realized that for him, this wasn't just land. It was a world he had invested his soul into. I listened to him, but the internal unease continued to grow. At one point, he suddenly asked, "Have you ever thought about how easy it is to become attached to a place? When it becomes not just a home, but something much bigger. Something your hands can't let go of, even if you know it's no longer your home?" I fell silent, not knowing how to respond. John spoke as though every word was not just a memory, but part of the very shadow that was starting to surround me. I felt his words seeping into me, invading my world, and I couldn't shake them off. We reached the edge of the property, where an old cabin stood, built, as he said, by his father. I could feel that this place was not just abandoned, but full of hidden stories. The cabin was made of rough logs with tiny windows through which barely any light filtered. Everything around it was covered in a layer of dust and time. John opened the door and invited me inside. "My father loved spending time here. This place was always special to him," he said, standing at the door looking at me. I slowly stepped inside. The room was dark and gloomy, but still it seemed to come alive in some way from the touch of time. And then I felt something in this place start to constrict my chest, making me feel out of place. It smelled of old wood and worn fabrics, but in the air there was more than just dust. There was a strange heaviness, as though behind these walls were memories that didn't want to be forgotten. I looked around. In the corner stood an old bench showing signs of years long forgotten. On the walls were several photographs, dulled by time. One of them caught my eye. It was a picture of him with his wife, but they weren't just happy in it. There was some strange unity with this place. Their eyes shone with a strange light, the same kind of light that appeared in John's eyes when he looked at me. I didn't know what terrified me more, the cabin itself or John's gaze, which never left me. He kept talking about his past, about how he spent days here with his wife, how their life had been full of meaning right here in this place. But something in his words felt wrong. "You understand what I'm talking about, don't you?" he suddenly asked, looking me directly in the eyes. I felt my heart skip a beat, but I remained silent. Everything around me was growing too dark, too heavy. I couldn't understand what frightened me more, what he was saying or the look in his eyes, which was turning into something far deeper and more intense. After we left the cabin, John and I remained silent. He continued walking ahead, but his steps had become noticeably slower, as if he himself wasn't in a hurry. I, on the other hand, felt the air around us thickening, and my chest tightened with anxiety. Everything around us felt so foreign, so unnatural. I couldn't explain what exactly was bothering me, but in every glance from John, in every word he spoke, there was a hidden purpose that I couldn't unravel. We returned to the house, and everything that had seemed cozy at first now gave me a sense of ominous inevitability. John suggested I sit on the porch, where old chairs were placed, and the fog that had started rising from the hills gently enveloped the entire property. He sat next to me, and we both fell silent. We sat in the quiet, only occasionally interrupted by the sound of the evening wind. John was lost in his thoughts, and I, in turn, tried not to notice what was unfolding between us. We were so close, but I felt like an invisible wall had grown between us, and all I could do was watch him slowly transform into something entirely unpredictable. After a while, he spoke, but his voice was muffled, with a tinge of sadness. "You know," he said, "my heart has always stayed here, in this house. This place. It keeps me. Have you ever wondered why it's so important to preserve the memory of the past?" His words were not easy to understand. They sounded like part of a long story I couldn't quite make sense of. I could feel his gaze, despite its softness, becoming insistent. He was talking about his grief, about how hard it was to cope with loss. But there was more than just sorrow in his words. I could sense that something else was hidden beneath them, something that could change everything. His gaze became deeper, and although he tried to appear calm, I could see the tension building in his eyes. I felt my fingers grip the edge of the chair. It was difficult to speak, but I couldn't sit there in silence. "I understand this is hard for you," I said, trying to hide my own confusion. "But you have to let go of this place, John. Sometimes you have to allow yourself to move on, even when it's difficult." I didn't know why I said that. But as soon as the words left my mouth, I felt something shift in the air. John looked at me, and for a moment, something strange flickered in his eyes. Not just pain, but something more. And in his silence, I felt a hidden threat. He stayed quiet for so long that I almost began to doubt whether I had made a mistake with my words. "You don't understand," he finally said, his voice tense. "This house, it's my life. I can't just let it go. I can't." It was hard for me to handle. With every passing minute, it became more and more obvious that this place, its history and John's figure were becoming something much darker and more complicated than I could have imagined. And although Michael was so far away, in his work, in his world, I felt like I couldn't be near this. My anxiety was becoming more apparent, but I couldn't leave the situation. There was something in this house that wouldn't let me go, and I was beginning to feel like something was holding me here. After I told John that his attachment to this house couldn't be his life, I felt the air around us grow heavy. He no longer looked at me with that shadow of sadness, as he had before. His face had become stone-like, as if there was no room in his gaze for sympathy or acceptance. I felt my anxiety growing, but all my attempts to ease the tension seemed futile. John remained silent, and I was losing myself in this silence more and more. Time dragged on, and every glance at him, at this house, increased the tension inside me. I didn't know why I felt this way, but something in this place was becoming unbearable. This feeling kept me on the edge, as though I were walking a dangerous line. When Michael returned late in the evening, I couldn't hide my unease. He looked exhausted, his eyes clouded with work, but I noticed how his gaze immediately shifted to me. He sensed my anxiety, but didn't ask what was wrong. He was too absorbed in his own thoughts, too detached. I realized that I couldn't expect his support in this. He was too distant, too alien to the situation, even if it concerned his family, his father. I decided to talk to him when he had some rest. I waited, hoping he would notice what was going on. But his silence made me feel even lonelier, and with every passing hour, my anxiety grew stronger. It felt as if I were losing control. With every step, with every look from John, I felt like I was slipping into an unknown space from which there would be no return. The next morning, after another walk around the property with John, I felt my anxiety reach its peak. Everything was the same. He talked to me about his old affairs, as always returning to memories of my mother-in-law, about how much he loved this land. But something in his voice, something in his words now sounded different. He spoke of the past as if it were something more alive than just a memory. I began to realize that this attachment to the place wasn't just part of his life. It was part of something else, something hidden, something that wouldn't let go of him. I walked beside him, but inside I felt more and more like I was standing on the edge of something terrifying. His behavior was becoming more insistent, his gaze more analytical. I tried to distract myself, thinking about leaving, about returning home, but I couldn't summon the strength to do it. He seemed to be everywhere, his presence growing more intrusive with every step. Everything in this house, all its details, the smells, even the shadows under the nails of the old doors made me feel like I couldn't leave. I was here, but I wasn't really here. I was somewhere between worlds, between what was happening with Michael and what was hidden in this house. When we returned to the house, I couldn't hide my unease. The feeling wouldn't let me go, but I didn't know how to explain it to Michael. He looked at me with a sort of confusion, and I felt his attention never really reached me. I was next to him, but it felt as though I was disappearing in this house. With each passing day, I became more vulnerable and helpless. I tried to continue living as usual, but the sense of threat was too strong to ignore. The day John suggested we take a walk in the forest, I already knew I had to be cautious. It felt like even the air in this house was filled with tension. He noticed my silence and, as always, offered to show me the old hunting cabin that had once belonged to his father. I knew it would likely be another one of those stories about the past that I had started avoiding. But something in his voice made me agree. He led me along familiar paths, and I followed him, barely thinking about where we were going. The forest was growing denser, the trees towering over us, and the sunlight barely breaking through the foliage. I felt how the silence surrounded us, pressing on me. John's gaze was fixed ahead, but his silence was growing heavier, as though something important, something unspeakable was hanging in the air. When we reached the cabin, I once again felt that familiar sensation. Something wasn't right here. The cabin stood in the heart of the forest, and it seemed to me that its walls held not only memories but also some hidden danger. Inside, it was dark and cold, and despite the fact that there was nothing surprising about it, I felt the growing anxiety inside me become almost tangible. John opened the door and I entered first. Inside, it was like an old abandoned place. The smell of dampness, stale air, dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. I looked around and noticed old furniture, peeling walls, and photographs on the walls. They were faded, almost erased by time, but in the center of one of the pictures, I saw him. John was standing with someone, and his expression was so strange, so empty. His eyes didn't reflect happiness, only an abyss. I couldn't tear my gaze away from the photograph, and it seemed that with every look, something changed in the air. This was my father, John said quietly, noticing that I was staring at the photo. He spent a lot of time here, with my mother. It was his sanctuary. He always said the cabin was a place where you could truly feel alive. His words sounded like part of a distant story that had no end. I tried to focus on his words, but something in them troubled me. He spoke as if this cabin was not just a physical place, but something more. I felt how the place was filling me with heaviness, how I was becoming part of this story. But at the same time, I understood that I had no right to be here. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. I know what you're feeling, John continued, and his voice grew even softer. The place can be dangerous, but it can also give us the answers we're looking for. This place, it holds secrets, and I want you to understand that. I couldn't understand what he meant. He looked at me as though waiting for some kind of response, but I couldn't give him what he wanted to hear. My anxiety grew, and I felt the room getting darker. There was something in this house that I couldn't fully comprehend, but I knew for sure. I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't stay here. I think we should go, I said, trying to make my voice firm. But John didn't respond. He simply looked at me and quietly said, "You can't leave until you understand that this place is calling to you." I froze. At that moment, I realized that this walk hadn't been a coincidence. This place, this forest, this house. It was all part of something much bigger than I could have imagined. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, and I knew I had to leave. Immediately. But despite all my efforts, I couldn't escape this place, as if it held me in its grip, forcing me to stay in that moment that offered neither relief nor freedom. We left the cabin, but even as we walked back along the forest path, the feeling of anxiety didn't leave me. John remained silent, his steps steady, and he walked slightly ahead, leaving me in this strange, uncomfortable solitude. It felt like the whole world around me had compressed into a single moment. I couldn't shake the feeling that with every step, I was becoming deeper embedded in this place that didn't want to let me go. When we finally reached the house, I felt the situation growing increasingly desperate. I didn't know how to explain to Michael what was happening, how to tell him that something unimaginable was taking place here. As always, he was absorbed in his work, unaware of what was unfolding in the house and in our relationship. His calmness had become my biggest problem. I could no longer ignore that something was wrong with John, with this house, with the atmosphere he was creating around us. That night, I couldn't sleep. The room was filled with suffocating silence, interrupted only by the sounds of nocturnal animals and the rustling of the window curtains. I lay in the dark, listening to every sound, but all I could hear was my own rapid breathing. It felt like the walls of the house were closing in on me, making me feel as if there was something unbearably heavy in my chest. I got out of bed and went to the window, trying to see something outside, though I knew nothing would change. The world outside was as dark and distant as my thoughts. I felt the pressure on my chest become unbearable. The room offered no comfort, no sign that I was safe. Everything around me felt dead, frozen. I returned to the bed and tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come. Soon I got up, deciding I couldn't stay here any longer. Quietly feeling for my bag, I decided to go to Michael. Not to say anything, just to talk, to see if he saw the same things I did. I didn't know why I decided to go to him in the middle of the night, why I couldn't wait until morning. Perhaps it was because the night's silence seemed to allow the truth to be seen. I knocked on his door, but he didn't respond. I knocked again, but this time I couldn't hold back my anxiety. Finally, he opened the door, sleepy and surprised. "What's wrong?" he asked, yawning, and I noticed how his eyes seemed not to notice my tension. "Michael, I need to talk to you, I said, though I wasn't sure what exactly I wanted to say. He looked at me again, puzzled, but let me into the room. I sat on the edge of the bed and he sat next to me. I didn't know where to begin, couldn't organize my thoughts. Have you noticed anything? Anything strange? I asked the question that had been tormenting me for days, but one he clearly didn't want to hear. He fell silent, but in his gaze, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. He didn't say a word, but suddenly I realized he too felt that something was wrong. Michael leaned back, staring at the ceiling. We were silent. I couldn't explain what was happening to us, couldn't explain how this trip had changed everything, but Michael remained as distant as ever. I felt that my words weren't reaching him. I tried to open him up, to talk about what was bothering me, but his silence only amplified the emptiness that was gradually closing in around me. I could no longer stay in this house, in this place, among these people who were so close yet so far from me. I stood up, not knowing where to go. And perhaps, at that moment, I felt that I was on the verge of a decision that would change everything.